Welcome back. So now that you know everything about the model view controller architecture and also how it's going to be implemented in our project, let's now actually go do that in practice. And this is going to be a long lecture, so let's get started. And let's start by creating the necessary new files so that we can then split up our code between them. So let's start by closing all of the folders here. And then inside of stores and JavaScript, let's create a new file, which will be called model.js. And so this is basically going to be the module in which we write our entire model. Then we also need the view, or actually the views, because we will have multiple views, basically one for each feature. So now we're working on displaying the recipe, and so this one is going to be called recipe view. But actually, let's create a new folder here for the views in order not to clutter our JavaScript folder. All right, and so then in here, let's create recipe view.js. So we will have one big module here for all the controllers, then one big file for the entire model, so for all the models basically, so for the recipe, for search, for bookmarks, and all of that. But for the views, we will have one module for each of the different views. And you'll understand why that makes sense as we keep developing our application. And probably the first reason that comes to mind is that the views are simply much bigger. And so we don't want a file with like 500 lines of code. We could, of course, also split up the model and the controller, and probably many people would do that, but I don't want to have to mess with a lot of files here in this project. That would just make it very confusing for you to follow. So let's actually take a look again here at this architecture that I showed you in the last video. And here we will actually start with the model. So again, we're going to have a big state object, which then inside will contain an object for recipe, search, and bookmarks. And now we will just start with the recipe, and then there will be a function for loading the recipe, right? So that function will then be called by control recipes, which kind of sits between loading the recipe and then rendering it using the view. So remember that the controller kind of sits between model and the view, so it acts like a bridge. All right, and let's actually keep it open here and close all of these others. And so here in our model, let's simply create that state object. And then in there, we have the recipe, which in turn is also an empty object, at least at the beginning. And then we will export this state so that we can then use it in the controller. And let's put them here just like in the diagram, model, controller, and view. Okay, so we're exporting the state from here. And now let's also create that load recipe function. And of course, we also export it so that we can use it in the controller. So load recipe. And this function will be the one responsible for actually fetching the recipe data from our Forkify API. And so this is going to be an async function. All right. And so now we can actually start grabbing some of the code from here. Okay. So as I said, basically the goal of this lecture is to refactor all the code here into the different parts of the architecture. Okay. So what here exactly is concerned with basically getting the data? So it starts here when we fetch the recipe from the API, and then basically it's all of this here. So all of this. So let's copy it. So rendering the spinner, of course, has nothing to do with the business logic, but really it is only presentation logic. And so this one will eventually go into the view. And then here, getting the ID, this is also not business logic. This is actually more about the application logic itself. So about making the application work. And so let's keep that part here. And so again, I will just copy this, or actually cut, and put it here. Now we start getting these errors, but never mind. Probably we should actually terminate our process here with Control-C so that we don't get errors all the time. Okay, now we need to, of course, adjust this here a little bit. So this first part here makes sense, right? Now we just need to get this ID from anywhere. So right now we have no idea which ID we should actually fetch. And so it's probably a good idea to pass that ID into this function. So the controller is the one that will actually get that ID right here. And so then when it calls the model, so the load recipe function, it can pass that ID into it. Then this part here can all stay the same, and this as well. And this actually should now not be the recipe, but state.recipe. And here we can just create a const from this. And here let's then also log state.recipe. All right. So this function here is not going to return anything. All it will do is to change our state object. So this big state object, which will then contain the recipe, and into which the controller will then grab and take the recipe out of there. And this is going to work because there is a live connection between the exports and the imports. Remember that? So when this state object here is going to get updated by load recipe, then that state is also updated in the controller, which imports the state. So let's now actually import all of that into here. So doing it here at the very top. So import, and then from the model, we simply want to import everything. So we have a couple of named exports here. So again, there are named exports and default exports, and these one are named exports because we explicitly gave them a name. And so here we can simply import everything and then call it the model. And so here in the controller, we will then end up with model.state and model.loadRecipe. Remember that? And then here, the current folder model.js. Okay. So let's go back here to loading the recipe, and the spinner should probably be outside of here. And so here, now let's actually call the function. So let's call model.loadRecipe and then pass in the ID. And this loadRecipe function is an async function. And so therefore, it is going to return a promise. Remember? And so therefore, here we have to await that promise before we can move on in the next step here in the execution of this async function. And so you see, this is exactly the situation of one async function calling another async function that we already studied in one of the previous sections. Remember that? And so again, it is really, really important to keep in mind that an async function will return a promise that we then need to handle whenever we call that async function. At least if we want to get some result out of it, or if we kind of want to stop the execution in the function that is calling the other async function. All right. So again, really important to understand the mechanics of what is happening here. Now here we should probably also have some error handling. So I forgot that part. So try on all the way down here, and then catch the error, and then alert the error as well. All right. So remember that this load recipe function here does not return anything. And so therefore, we are not storing any result into any new variable. Instead, here we will get access to state.recipe. So to that state.recipe that is going to be manipulated right here. So you see that this load recipe function here clearly is not a pure function. So it has the side effect of manipulating this variable that is outside of it. And there would be different ways of avoiding that, but that is just a lot of work, and it's just not worth it here in this case. We are still trying to learn here, remember. But anyway, we now here have access to model.state.recipe. And so just in order to see if everything still works, let's store that recipe into the recipe variable so that we can then render it using this code that we already have here. So just temporarily recipe and then destructure it. So let's give it a save and let's restart our application here. All right. Let's reload here and you see that it's working. Right? So everything we implemented so far was correct. And that's pretty important to keep checking when we are refactoring code like this. Okay. So that was actually the easy part. Now comes the recipe view, which will then contain basically all the rest of the code that we have here. So let's go here and set the view up. So the view is going to be a class, and in this case called recipe view. And we do this because later we will also have a parent class called view, which will contain a couple of methods that all the views should inherit. And so using classes makes all of this very simple to implement. Also, we want each view to have a couple of private methods and properties. And so classes makes this really easy to implement again. And just in general, I feel that classes are really the right way to go here. And again, it will make even more sense once we start to add the parent class of view. But anyway, I mentioned that I want each of these classes to have a couple of private properties. And one of them is going to be the parent element. So parent element, and let's right away set the parent element to the recipe container. So basically to this element, all right? Because this will then make it really easy to render the spinner and to render success or error messages, or to render, of course, the recipe itself. So if each of the views has this parent element property, then it will be really easy to do all of those tasks. And again, that will become really clear once we start adding more and more views. But now the next thing I want to do is to actually export something from this module. So of course, we have to export something from this view so that the controller can then use it. Now, what are we going to export from this view? So we might export, of course, the entire class like this. And so then here in the controller, we would have to import that class and create a new object out of that class. So basically create a new recipe view object, right? However, in that situation, it might be possible to create more than one view, and we would never want that. Also, that would add unnecessary work to the controller, which we basically want to keep as simple as possible. And so in order to avoid all that, we will already create the object here and then export that object. And so like this, no one from the outside of this class here will have access to anything except for the object. So what we will do is to export default and then a new recipe view. All right, and that's actually it. So we don't pass any data in, and so therefore we don't need any constructor even. Okay? And then here all we do is import, and here we then can give it any name. So I'm calling it recipe view because I think that's what makes most sense. And then views, and then recipe view .js. Now, how do we then actually pass any data into the recipe view? Because if we're not creating the new object ourselves, then we cannot pass any data in, like for the constructor, right? So we cannot pass any data into this recipe view, well, because we're creating that object right here in the recipe view module already. But actually, I did that on purpose so that we can create a very nice method called render. So what I will want to do here, and let me already write it here, even before having the method. So what I will want to do is to call recipe view dot render. And then here, all we do is to pass in the data, which will be model.state.recipe. And this method here called render is a very common name for methods. For example, in React, it is also called render. And so I think this is a nice name. It's really descriptive of what is going to happen. All right. So if we did export the entire class, then here we would have to do like const recipe view equal new recipe view or something like that. And then here we would have to pass in the data like this when we create the new recipe. And of course, this would also be possible, but honestly, I like it better like this. So having this nice render method is a lot more descriptive and a lot cleaner, and also for the reasons that I explained previously already. Now, anyway, this render method here will now accept this data and will then store it into the object. So let's add the public render method. So this is, of course, part of the public API. So this receives data and will then set this dot data to the data it just received. So we need to declare that up here. And so this render method here and these two properties are something that all the views are going to have in common. And this will be really beautiful to work with, as you will see. But now let's actually do something with this data, which is to actually render it. So basically what we want now is to take all of this code and cut it from here and put it into our view. Okay. Now we will actually not put it into the render method because again, this method will later be common to all the views, so to all the classes. However, each view will of course render a different HTML. And so we will simply have a method that generates that HTML so that the render method can then render that HTML. So if that sounds confusing, let me write it in code. So generate markup. And so this is going to be a private method. And since we're using Babel here, I can already use this syntax here. So pasting the code here. And so this is going to generate this markup variable, and we can actually immediately return that from here. Okay. Now, this is not going to do anything yet, because what is recipe here in this case? It's nothing, right? It's not defined at all. Now, in this case, where is this data actually? Well, it is in this .data, right? So why is that? So let's take a look at our controller. And let's start from the beginning. So the recipe is loaded here, and then that will store it into the state object, right? Here we don't need that anymore. Then here we take model.state.recipe, which is that data that we just received here in step 1, and then that data is passed into the render method, right? And so render method then takes that data and stores it inside of this .data. And so this is so that we can then use that data all over the place inside of this object. And by the way, this is exactly what we have here in this architecture diagram. So inside of control recipes, the load recipe function is called, then the recipe data goes into the state, and then that data passes right through the controller basically and goes into the render method, which then in turn calls generate markup. So you see, we already have many things here implemented already, like data and parent element. We're just missing some small parts, but we are going to get there. But now what we were doing here is to discuss where this recipe data is actually located right now. And we came to the conclusion that it is in this .data. So I will copy it, and then we need to replace all the recipe dot here with that. So I'm hitting Command D. So for you that should be Control D. And then let me paste that dot, and then that's it. All right. Then down here we have this code, which is not supposed to be here, because all this function does is to return an HTML string. And it's going to be the render method that will be responsible for then actually putting that HTML onto the page. Okay. So here, let's say that the markup is this dot, so generate markup. Well, this is probably something that's coming from Babel here. Not really sure why, but apparently VS Code doesn't like this yet. We're still missing the dot here, of course. And now it appears to be working. And of course, we still get some errors here, but never mind about that. We are still refactoring. So we have our markup. Now we need to put it on the page. So again, we need to start by clearing the parent element. And actually, let's create another small method for that. So just to get in the habit of abstracting some code. And so now this is where our parent element will come into play. Because now we can say this dot parent element dot inner HTML and set it to empty, right? And so this method here will be usable for all the views as long as all the views have a parent element property like this one, right? So all of this will become really reusable, as you will see in one of the future lectures. So here we now can then call that. And then to finish, we can finally render that HTML to the page. And so here, once again, we can now use this dot parent element and then insert that HTML there. Okay, so this might already be working, actually. So all of this here looks good to me. Let's take a look at the controller. And you see that this is now a really nice and small function here already, right? Now this one, we actually want to call it control recipes. So let's replace it everywhere. Control recipes. So that's the name that I have here in the diagram. Okay. And so now what we're missing is only to export the render spinner also into the view. So this one, of course, also has nothing to do with the controller, and so it belongs in the view. So of course not a function, but a method. And this one will also be a public method, so that the controller can then call this method here as it starts fetching the data. Okay? And now here again, we have the beauty of the parent element already being inside of the object. So this one we can simply delete, and here we can replace it with this dot parent element. All right. Next up, I'm seeing that this icons variable is not going to be defined anywhere in this module. So we will need to grab that from here. So you see that here we have the icons, and we don't need them here anymore, at least. So now we need them right here. And now what we need to do is to then call this render spinner method right here. So that's going to be recipe view dot render spinner. And here again, we no longer need to pass in the parent element. And just watch how beautiful this is. So we have recipe view and then render spinner. And we already know that this will then automatically render the spinner on the recipe view. And the same is later going to happen with other views. For example, with the bookmarks view. We will also have a render spinner on the bookmarks view, and it's going to work the exact same way. And the same with render. So all we have to do is to call these same methods then on all the views, and they will then simply act on whatever view that we are calling them. Right? And that works so nice because we have this parent element here and also this data property. So I think that this is a really nice architecture. And so let's now actually see if this works. So let's reload this here. And here we have some errors. So apparently if there is a really big error, then Parcel will let us know about that. And in this case, the problem is that it failed to resolve this URL. And that actually makes sense because this view here is in a different folder, right? So here we are only going one folder up, and going up one folder from here will end up in the JavaScript folder. However, we want to go into images. So we need to go up one more level. So like this. Okay, so here we have apparently some bug. Let's just see if anything happens still on this event, and it does. There's still some problem here. Maybe that has to do with the fact that we are using these private methods here. So let me change this here to this one. So right here, yeah. And let's also comment out this one, and then we're not using any private methods anymore. However, that is apparently still not working. All right, so let's take a look here at our this.data. So this.data, just to see what we get here. And so we see that apparently that method is not even being called. And I see the problem. I actually did not call it. So I didn't use the parentheses, right? So what a stupid mistake. So let's roll back on all the changes I did, except of course for this one. But here, probably all I need to do is to call these two methods. Beautiful. So we're back. It's working now again, and it's working really nice, including the spinner. Okay. And so I think with this, we successfully refactored our entire code to this new architecture. Well, not the entire code actually. We're still missing this handler here and all of this part that is here, but don't worry about that for now. Okay, we will have a separate lecture which will talk about how we can handle events in this particular architecture. For now, what matters is that this works just nicely. There's just one thing that I actually want to change, but that has nothing to do with the architecture. So what I want to change is these numbers. So do you see here we have 0.5, but in the real world, you will see this more like this. So like 1/2 tablespoon of brown sugar instead of 0.5. So this looks a lot nicer, or this, for example, 1.5 is a lot nicer than 1.5. And so for that, we are actually going to use an external library which will very easily do this for us. Okay? And so I included this part so I could show you just how to do this. So let me just Google it here, npm fractional, just so we can see what this package looks like. So if you Google npm, then you will usually end up on npmjs.com, and this will then contain like one page for each package that is on npm. All right. And so here what you see is that you can basically create new fractions based on numbers, and then you can do all kinds of multiplications with them, like multiplying, dividing, and in the end converting them to a string. And so that's what we will do now. So we will convert each number to a fraction and then immediately convert them to a string. So this is how we install it. Let's just grab that. And then we need our terminal back. Let's add another one. So that's the plus sign. And this should be pretty fast, hopefully. And so we need that here. So let's import fractional from, and then fractional. And so here again, you see that any libraries or any packages that we import from npm, we don't even have to specify any path. All we have to do is to write their names here. And then here we need also what they export. And let me see what they actually export. So it should be called fraction. Okay. So this library actually exports something called fraction. And we can see that because here it is importing the fractional library using require. And that is simply the old CommonJS way of importing, which I showed you earlier. And so that is one of the reasons why I showed that to you, because, yeah, again, you will see this all the time in the wild still, because so many packages on npm are still using CommonJS. So let's import fraction here, actually like this. Okay, let's just see if this actually does exist now. And yeah, it does. So actually that's even fraction inside of fraction. But anyway, let's now go ahead and use this actually. So that is in here. So here we now no longer simply want the quantity, but we want the quantity converted to a fraction string. So according to the documentation, we have to say new fraction, and in this case, it's actually fraction dot fraction. So again, that's because here inside of fraction is where the fraction function is actually located. Okay, and here you could see that we have to then use new. Now, actually, to make this a bit nicer, we can also use destructuring here right away. So we can do this. And if we now take a look, well, now we have this bug here, but never mind. So let's just do this and then call toString on that, just like it said in the documentation. So you see that now as I destructured that fraction, it became the actual function. And yeah, here you see beautifully that it is now in this size or in this format of the fraction. And if I take a look at the other one, then the same as well. Now, this one doesn't look very beautiful, but never mind. So we cannot fix all of it, but at least this looks really cool now, right? And so this is when we reach for packages on NPM. So when we need some functionality that we don't want to implement ourselves. I'm just going back here because I noticed some problem here, which was this one. And that was because previously here we had null. So there was no value for this cilantro. And so here we should probably check if the number does exist. So we can say inc.quantity. If it exists, then do this. And if not, then simply put an empty string there. And of course not here. So that must be out here. Yep, now it's gone and it looks a lot nicer. All right. Now just to finish, I actually want to refactor this function here. So let me grab this and put it down here and call it generate markup ingredients, or just ingredient. Okay, and this will then receive the ingredient. Okay, and then here inside of the map, we can then simply call this dot, and let's copy it because these private methods, for some reason, VS Code doesn't really understand them yet. So right here. And so successfully refactored this part. And so we are now done in this lecture where we also successfully refactored the entire code that we already had to the model view controller architecture. All right. So we're not done 100%, but we've done a lot of work in this lecture. And I really hope that you understood everything that we did here. So this was a really, really, really important lecture. So make sure that you understand everything that we did. So make sure to review all the code and also compare it here with this diagram one more time so that you see which functions we call when, and then also how exactly the data flows between these different functions, and especially here in this view. Because I know that this can get a little bit confusing. And so reviewing this is going to be a very good idea, especially because we will use this so many times also in the other features. And so by then, you really must understand how all of this fits together, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to follow the rest of the project. Okay, so take your time and only then move on to the next video.